Jesus is teaching his disciples about what is to happen to him. And a key moment that he describes is where he will be handed over to men and that they will kill him. And we see that term in the original Greek over and over again, the term handing over or to be handed over. We hear about it here, of course, in the gospel, in Mark's gospel, chapter 9. We also hear about it where Judas was to betray Jesus, was to hand him over to the Jewish leadership, and Pontius Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. And yet at the same time, we also recognize that none of these things that happened to Jesus were by accident, that Jesus knew what was to happen to him. But it was not a moment where he would be a victim of circumstance. Rather, our Lord, in obedience to God the Father, foreknew what was to happen, and he accepted it willingly in such a way where we could say that by God's permission, our Lord was crucified, so that it was part of the plan of salvation. And so the other kinds of handings over that we see is where the Father hands over his Son into the world, and Jesus himself hands over his own life to be stretched out on the cross for all of us. This handing over of our Lord did not end on the day of his crucifixion. Our Lord continues to hand himself over in the sacraments, and particularly here in the Blessed Sacrament, the sacrament of the altar, that is the sacrament of the Eucharist, where our Lord is literally handed over to all of you as you approach the altar to receive him in communion. He hands himself over once again to be in a kind of death, of annihilation as food, so that he can bring about life within you. How powerful that is, how amazing that is. We are beneficiaries of the handing over of our Lord. First, in the atonement of sin upon the cross, and then in the Eucharist, in the sacred scriptures, and also in the teachings of the Church. We Catholics believe in sacred tradition. We actually write it down with a capital T, tradition, which refers to the official teaching of the Church. And tradition has its root in the Latin word tradere, which means to hand on, to hand on. And St. Paul himself uses that word when he speaks about handing on the faith. This handing on that we are beneficiaries of, however, is not the end. It's not the end of the cycle of handing on or handing over. I don't know if you remember the term WWJD. I haven't really seen it around on T-shirts and wristbands like I used to, but we know what it stands for. It's an acronym that means, what would Jesus do? And that term was helpful to help especially young people to ask themselves that question whenever they are in a situation where they have to make a decision to do the right thing. And so they can ask themselves, if Jesus was in this situation, what would he do? And I should do that. And that's a very helpful question to ask. And yet at the same time, it's a bit incomplete with regard to what it really means to be a follower of Jesus, to be a Christian. Because sometimes it could be a bit superficial to ask that question if we believe that Jesus is merely a good person to be imitated in order for us to live a good life, especially because good, in the common sense of the word, doesn't really measure up to what good really means in the context of being a Christian. Since good in the common way that it's used means basically don't break the law and be nice to people, right? But good, true goodness, goes far deeper than that. We find true goodness in God alone. We find true goodness in Jesus. And so what we really should be asking isn't, what would Jesus do? Rather, we would ask the question, what does Jesus want me to do, who dwells within my very soul right now? What does Jesus want to do through me at this very moment? What does Jesus want me to do? What does he want me, or how does he want me to hand over my own life to him and in service to others? That's too long to put in an acronym, so I'm not going to bother. That's the question that we would ask. In other words, the handing over ends with us and how we hand ourselves over to our Lord and hand ourselves over in service to others. So, my friends, as we approach the holy altar in continuing the celebration of this Eucharist, let's ask ourselves that question. Are we in a true and deep relationship with our Lord, or is our Lord merely someone to imitate? Is the Lord the source of my life, and is he my all? Is he my life? Or is he merely one person among others? And let's continue then, if we wish for the Lord to be the center of our life, let's continue to pray every single day, to be open to how he wants to transform us, and especially in the Eucharist, so that we can continue to experience Jesus handing himself over to us, and we hand ourselves over to him, and he in turn hands us over to God the Father, where we will be complete and happy.